Hello, this is Wayne Warner, and I'm interviewing Harry Carr today, Tuesday, December 4th, 2007. And also present at this interview are Jim Tice, Warner Bullock, and John Aldridge. This interview is sponsored by the Missouri State University, the Springfield Greene County Library System, and the Air and Military Museum of the Ozarks. Our veteran, Mr. Harry Carr, was born October 10th, 1926. And Harry, for the record, which branch of the military were you in, and what was your rank?
Well, I was in the Army Tank Corps, and I ended up being a three-stripe sergeant, better known as a buck sergeant.
Buck sergeant, and tell us when you went into the military.
I went in the first day of June of 1945, and took my training, basic training and everything at Fort Knox, Kentucky.
Let's go back to your early years and tell us where you were born and where you grew up.
Well, I was born here in Springfield, Missouri, at the old Burge Hospital over on North Jefferson. And I've lived here all my life, went to school here, and the only time I lived any place else is when Uncle Sam invited me to be with him for a little over 2 years.
Well, let's go back. Tell us something about your parents. Were there military people in your family before you went in yourself?
No, well, I'd say yes, because my uncle on my mother's side was in the First World War, and during that time, 1918 and all, in France, in Germany. Claude Rathbone was his name.
And Army?
Yeah, he was in the Army. He was in the Quartermaster Corps, actually.
Army. All right, you grew up in the Great Depression. Can you tell us something about going through the Depression? What was your father doing at that time?
Well, actually, I was one of the lucky ones. My dad was in the retail coal business for about 42 years, and I grew up during that period, and even during the Second World War, coal was a priority. So his business went ahead, wasn't interfered with, particularly at that time, and of course, same way with during the Depression. The only thing is, a lot of times he had to take eggs or chickens or other things in payment as opposed to money during the Depression.
What was the name of the coal company?
Carr Coal Company.
Carr Coal, here in Springfield.
Yes, sir.
You were about 15 years of age when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. Tell us about that day, what you remember about it.
Well, of course, it was on December the 7th, and we had been to church and went to lunch down at the Frisco Harvey House here in Springfield, which we usually did on Sunday at noon. And they had a radio there, and they had it on just because that was the news time and everything. And then they broke in to talk about the bombing of Pearl Harbor, and most everybody kind of stared at each other because nobody really knew where Pearl Harbor was. When they began to talk about Hawaii and all, they began to register with us, but that name didn't register out here in the Midwest too well as far as where it was.
And you went home, I suppose you turned the radio on and listened to more news?
Well, yes, all afternoon and everything. Of course, everybody was disturbed and excited and trying to find out what was going on, and little by little, because all the papers didn't have anything at that time. All it was the radio, what news they had.
Did you know of anybody in Springfield who was at Pearl Harbor at the time?
Not personally, no. I did later, some fellows we had known and everything, but I didn't know anybody offhand at that time.
How did it affect a teenager? When you went to school the next day, what happened?
Well, we all kind of decided that one of these days we probably have to be in the Army or what, Navy or whatever. And at that age, we weren't too knowledgeable about war or anything else, like most people out here. Of course, I figured out that nobody realized how long it was going to go or anything, so had no idea when I would be involved in it or if I would be.
So how did you prepare for entering the military? You were 15 and now you got...
Well, of course, the main thing was the home front that people had to help the war effort, saving cans and grease, and old tires, bed springs, and anything we could find or help clean out barns or garages or whatever, to get those things to put into the government so they could make military equipment out of or anything else. And then we lived with the idea of rationing, because soon after it got going, well, of course, gasoline and other items that the military really used a lot of was limited, and of course you begin to learn how to get along with less.
And your father delivered coal, so he had some special concessions there, I guess, for tires and...
Oh, well, yes,
gasoline.
yeah, the trucks, of course, and they could get gasoline, and they had tires and everything, but you couldn't buy any new trucks or anything. You had to keep them going, because everything was military equipment from then on.
Did you learn to drive the truck and deliver coal?
Yeah.
So you were prepared as a truck driver to go into the Army.
Right.
But I know you wound up being a tank driver, so we'll talk about that a little bit later. But how did you, when you got out of high school, did you immediately join, or were you drafted, or how did that happen?
I was drafted. But I was allowed to finish school, which was in the end of May. And so then I reported the next day or two to the draft board, and was earlier in the year of 1945, I had been sent to Jefferson Barracks in St. Louis for physicals and all that. And so they had that one all taken care of, but I was allowed to come back and finish school because I only had about 4 or 5 months' time. And then we were put on a bus and sent back to Jefferson Barracks. And of course, I didn't know I was going to end up in the tank corps, and that's what I wanted, but I didn't know I was going to be there for sure.
Were there other fellows in school, or some of your friends in that same group?
Oh, yeah, yes.
Can you name some of these guys?
Well, yes, and in the school I went to here in Springfield, Greenwood High School, you're told to have 15 boys and 15 girls in a class. And when we graduated, there were 9 boys and 9 girls. So a lot of the parents and people had moved away because of jobs for the government, you know, working on the factories and things, or moved because they were in the service. And one of my best friends, Fred Roman, was joined the Navy, and another one, David Nolan, he was in the Navy. There was several of them that went in the Army and the Air Force. Just about everybody was gone at that time. And one thing about our school, we had a coach, our football coach and basketball coach, of course, that started us all off on our junior and senior year of teaching us how to march military style, which was a great help when you got in the service. You didn't have 2 left feet then.
Mm-hmm. And tell us about that day that you took the second bus ride to St. Louis, and you said goodbye to your parents and friends, and headed toward St. Louis. Tell us your feelings on that.
Well, of course, everybody was sad and at the end away and glad, and the young fellas were all very excited about what was happening, not realizing. And of course, the war was still going on at that time. Germany hadn't surrendered or anything then. But the going there to Jefferson Barracks, and of course going through the process system, which you have opportunity to join the Navy or the Marines or the Air Force. They would ask you, you know, if you wanted to. And I kept saying, no, I want to be on the Army Tank Corps. And the funny part about the whole thing was, usually it took about 4 or 5 days for them to complete the process before you were shipped anywhere. And about the latter part of the second day or the first part of the third day, this big old sergeant came and hollered out my name. I jumped about 3 foot tall, so I didn't know what I'd done or what he wanted. And he said, "You come and go with me." And I thought, oh boy, what have I done? I hadn't done anything. And he said, "You want to get in the Tank Corps?" And I said, "Yes, Sergeant, I do." He said, "Okay." So they run me through the process in about half a day, the rest of it. And by that evening, I was on a train to Fort Knox. So for once, it worked out. When you kept asking for something, you got it.
Let's go back to Jefferson Barracks. Was that a fort at that time in World War II?
Oh yes, it was a reception center, is what it's called. And of course, it had been a fort back during the Civil War and in that area. But yeah, this is a reception center, and they shipped people from every direction. Most of the fellows that I was on the bus with going up there ended up down at Camp Chaffee, Arkansas, in the Medical Corps. And so I went where I went, and we arrived at Fort Knox along the middle of the night, down at south of Louisville, Kentucky.
That's Tennessee, Fort Knox?
Kentucky.
Kentucky, okay.
Kentucky.
Sorry.
Your money's down there at Fort Knox, remember?
Sorry to throw you off.
That's all right.
I'm thinking of something else. Well, now, but you got there in the middle of the night, and then what happened? You had your uniforms already. You had
Oh yeah, you had all your gear and everything as a recruit. And they unloaded us and took us over and fed us. And then you went to a barracks to spend the night until the next morning. And what we always laughed about was we didn't have any bedding or anything, but the barracks wasn't full, so we were laying on a mattress, and then we got another mattress and laid it on top of us to keep warm.
And this is the month of
May.
May, 1945.
Uh-huh.
All right, now, are you going to take some infantry basic before you go into the Tank Corps? Tell us about that.
13 weeks of basic training. Of course, indoctrination of all kinds of things, and training, and of course lots of marching, and lots of long, nice walks in the morning and the evening, and it was very interesting. Of course, basic and myself and a lot of others of us coming out at that age and out of school, we were all in pretty good shape to do all those things. It didn't bother us, as it did some of the older men at that time. We had several fellows that went from Springfield and were sent, of course, to Fort Knox and and of course they had other kind of jobs, and of course that physical training was a little hard on them to start with, like that, where it wasn't for us, but we were young and in good physical condition that way.
And the sergeants were very kind to you.
Oh yes.
Told you.
Yes. They asked us if we'd be glad to do something. Yes. And but really they weren't that way. You know, the movies always make them sound like they're monsters, but they, and most of them we had, of course, at that time, a lot of them were veterans, officers and the sergeants, and
had been in World War I.
World War II, part of it, sent back. Parts of it for training, and for, of course, some of them had been injured and everything, but weren't fit for duty, but at the fort they could train them.
So you're in the Tank Corps, but you have 13 weeks of basic,
Basic training.
and you're in good shape. So you're all ready to go into the war era.
Well, and then we go into tank
Corps, yeah.
tank training itself. In a sense, of course, a lot of places they like if you're maybe in artillery or something like that, you might have trained one place and gone another. But of course, Fort Knox being the headquarters of the armored division, everything was right there.
Did you have anybody from Springfield with you?
No.
You didn't know anybody else
No,
there?
I've met a lot of fellows from all over the United States.
How about homesickness?
Oh, sure. Yeah. That's the first time I'd ever been away from home for any length of time. And some days you got a little homesick, but that was one thing about it. Any training, they kept you busy enough you didn't have time to think too much about it.
You had some night maneuvers, I suppose.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Day and night. Training, and of course, then you took the tanks out to artillery range, and you learned to shoot the guns and things like that.
Describe the tanks that you trained in. What kind of tanks were these?
They were Shermans, as they call the M4 Sherman. And through the process of tank training, you learn to drive several different types of vehicles. A half-track, of course, a Jeep, 2.5-ton truck, and then the light tanks, and then, of course, the medium tank, which was the M4. So we had an all-around training, so you could know how to operate any vehicle of that type if you happened to come upon it during the thing.
What's the crew consist of in a tank like that?
5 men in those days. The driver and assistant driver, the gunner, the loader, and the tank commander.
So could you do all of those jobs?
You learned it all. And a certain amount of maintenance, of course, too. Field maintenance to keep things going.
How many weeks is
that went on for about 2 months. 2 months' time. Roughly 8 or 9 weeks, something like that.
Did you ever come to the conclusion that you made the wrong decision? You shouldn't have asked for tanks? Or?
Not until I saw a lot of pictures and years later. How bad off we really were in some ways, because naturally we were told we had the best. And that wasn't always the true statement as far as the Germans were concerned, because they had tanks later on, especially. It was 2 and 3 times better than we were, and they lost a lot of American men and a lot of American tanks because of that. Of course, the country was unprepared, and they did as much as they could as fast as they could, and didn't know any more until it was later on.
So you're all privates entering this training, and who takes command? How do you get promoted, and who's the tank commander?
Well, of course, in training, you all take turns of all the positions. And then, of course, when you're actually in a unit, you're still that way, except each tank, the head man, the commander of the tank, was usually a buck sergeant. So how they picked them, I don't know, but eventually along the line you got promoted, and then you got promoted to whatever rank it was that was in charge of the tank. Of course, naturally, somebody's got to be in charge at all times. And you might have had some privates, and you had some corporals, and might have had another sergeant in there. But one man was actually in charge of the whole thing.
How about describe maneuvers? How about these mock battles you get into in the training?
Well, mostly it was on the artillery range, and then they would drive around. Of course, Fort Knox is a lot like Missouri is, very rugged mountain area, and they had lots of ranges and lots of area where you could learn to drive and have maneuvers and everything. And they just set up a situation, and you had to move forward. And then, of course, the Army troops were the real maneuvers, and the Army troops were there, and so everybody else, so that it was just like a army going into the battle. So,
Any accidents in training?
oh yeah, there was several. Yeah, there was several. Of course, the motor pools basically where they kept the tanks and all the other vehicles was in the more or less in the center part of Fort Knox. And of course, when they were through training on the field, they came on back in, and the tanks had to be cleaned off because of the mud and dirt and everything. And one day, it turned out to be hilarious, but it wasn't at the moment. If anybody remembers military, you always had the military police at intersections with directing traffic, and of course going back to the fort, those military police rode in jeeps, and they'd get out at the intersection and stop the traffic so the tanks could go on through or turn or whatever they needed to do. And this particular day, when you brought tanks back from the field, the instructor, which like I was later on, drove the tank, and the troops that you took out there to the range for driving or whatever just rode along with you. Well, we had a few lazy sergeants, I guess, in the Army, and he let a crewman drive back. And when it came to making a turn, he got excited, and instead of turning, he headed directly for the jeep that the military police were sitting in. And they got out rather quickly, because when they got past that tank, passed over that jeep, it was flatter than a pancake. Of course, the sergeant in charge of that tank, we never saw him again. We don't know exactly what happened, but he was probably peeling potatoes for the rest of his life. But those two MPs were in that thing. I mean, they bailed out of that sucker in a hurry because they saw it coming down the street and wasn't turning like it's supposed to. But other things happened. There was accidents and things. And, nobody at that particular time I know of got killed or anything, but there was some got injured at different things where they'd have a wreck or tank would run off the road and turn over or something like that. So.
Of course, back then in 1945, you didn't have a cell phone.
No.
Could you call home on a pay phone to talk to your parents, your family?
Yes.
By the way, did you have other brothers who were in the military?
No, I'm the only child. No brothers, no sisters. Yeah, they had telephones, of course, banks of them everywhere, payphones, and at the PX and other places, and you could call home.
Did you have a commencement? Is there a graduation in tank corps?
Oh yeah, well, they have anytime they can have a parade. Why, they'd have a parade, and then of course that's when you graduated from tank school, and then you were signed to some unit somewhere or kept there at the fort or whatever the case might be.
What was the worst job that you had in training in tank corps?
Well,
seems like cleaning up that tank would be a nasty job.
But of course the maintenance people did all the work on them and everything. We take them to what we call a car wash now, and we'd give them a bath with a big hose and everything. Mainly cleaning them out and everything inside the compartments and everything. It was rather messy sometimes and hot in the summer and cold in the winter. So. But as far as training was concerned, it wasn't bad at all. Of course, I ended up staying there till the end of December 1945, teaching tank driving.
So, still there in the summertime, the war with Japan was still going on, and you were thinking perhaps you would be sent to the Pacific?
Yes, we didn't know, of course, where, but since the war in Germany and Europe was over with, why, we figured that Japan or something in that vicinity would be the next thing for us to do. And of course, then when it was over in September, then we didn't know what we were going to be doing. Of course, naturally, we all thought we were going to get out of the Army at that time, but we didn't.
You stayed for the duration plus, or?
Yeah, for about almost a year and a half, or more,
Hmm.
and at that time. And
Well, after you got your bedding, what were the living conditions like in the barracks?
oh well, it was very good in a sense. Of course, the old two-story barracks building, and they're all heated by big coal stoves. And of course, we had plenty of blankets and sheets and everything. We did not suffer for that part or from eating any. The food was good, and those accommodations at the fort were very well taken care of.
What's the weather like in Tennessee and
Kentucky.
Kentucky? I'm sorry, I'm going to get you in Tennessee yet. Kentucky.
Like here, we're actually on the same parallel as we are there, and it was hot in the summer and cold in the winter.
What about the equipment? Did they have enough? Did you run out of gear or supplies? Or?
You know, at that time they had, of course, enough of everything as far as we were concerned, and of course then all of a sudden there was a huge surplus of everything when the war was over. But no, we had equipment that was, and we had some of the latest tanks, designs that they had, and we also trained in one that came out at that time called the M26, which was the first large usable tank. A few of them were sent to Germany at the end of the Second World War and got in combat, but they were too late for very much because the war was over.
So I'm picking up from you that our tanks were inferior to the German tanks.
Well, they weren't to begin with, but they were later because of the German 88, and they built tanks that could carry the German 88, and of course their artillery pieces were 88s, and they could go right through it. There's a tank at one of the museums here in the United States, and the barrel of the tank's about that big around, and there was a bullet hole right through it. And when you stop and think how straight that had to hit on a curve, and how hard it was going and everything, it went right straight through that barrel on the tank, both sides and out the other. Why, you can see the power behind that. It didn't bend the barrel or anything.
That was the German 88?
German 88 went through it like that. And of course, they were bad. Our tanks, they burned diesel and we burned gasoline. And we were known, the British called them Ronsons. Our tanks Ronsons because they'd light every time.
So we learned some things.
Yeah, the hard way. Which was the way we always do everything.
You were stationed there during the summer. You could go out on leave or a weekend pass, or
Yeah.
what did you do for entertainment?
Well, the city of Louisville, Kentucky is only about 35 miles north of there. And they ran buses back and forth to there for the weekend. And there was a lot of things to do.
Did you have contact with local people? Did you attend the church services out there?
Yeah, and of course they had chapels on the base and everything too. Yeah, and they, you didn't go every Saturday because it got a little expensive too to go in and do things. But no, Louisville's a great town, and of course then eventually when I was there, I got to go home more often too.
Were you married at that time?
No, I didn't get married until the end of 1947.
After you finished your training, you went in, you became an instructor yourself.
Yeah.
And how long were you in that?
Well, from about September to the end of December. And then we were gathered up a whole group of cadre and officers and all, shipped to California, Fort Ord, California, At that point, we were joined up with a large group of recruits that had just gotten out of basic training and tank training and everything, and sent to Fort Walton, Washington.
Near Seattle? You were going to ship over someplace?
We were shipped to Korea, South Korea. Well, basically all of Korea in that sense, as an occupation force, because the Japanese had occupied Korea for 40 years. And so they had no government, they had nothing to guide themselves with. And so we went over there as occupation force and to help clean up, because the country is well known these days as a very rugged country, and there were still Japanese holding out in different places that didn't even know the war was over with. And we went that, and we were stationed right just south of the 38th parallel, which is the borderline now between the north and south.
You're saying we. Who is we?
The tank corps that we were in, which became the 754th Tank Battalion, and which belonged to the 7th Division, which is an infantry outfit, which is part of the occupation force of Korea at that time.
We don't have a picture of that patch, but can you describe the 7th Infantry patch?
It's red with a black hourglass in the middle of it. It looks like an hourglass.
Oh, yes.
And it's a red round patch. And we were, Seoul, Korea, the capital, is about 30 miles south of where we were, so at that time.
How did you get along with the Koreans there right after the war?
Oh, they were very nice.
Were they glad to see you?
Very glad to see the Americans. Oh, yes. We managed to live in a barracks that had originally been built by the Russians, because they had been there at one time, many years before, and then the Japanese, of course, took it over, and they used the barracks. There were 2- and 3-story barracks, and of course that part of the world gets very cold in the winter, 20 and 30 below zero without any trouble at all. And these barracks were built to withstand that, and they did. Of course, they hadn't been damaged in the war because there was no fighting there. The Japanese just finally were picked up and gave up, were told to quit by their country, those that could be found.
Do you stay warm in a tank?
No, sir.
It's cold, huh?
No, they're warm in the summer and cold in the winter. Because the air conditioning in those is just the air that passes through them, and in the wintertime that air comes through to cool that engine and behind you, and of course that brings in some real nice cold air.
Did the Army have enough warm clothing in those days?
Yes, and when I was in, they did, oh yeah. But earlier they didn't, because they just didn't prepare for it or think things were going to happen that long a time.
Well, comes a time that they tell you you're about ready to be discharged. Tell us about those days.
Well, they told us, of course, the point system had been lowered as the time passed on, so they got out, of course, quicker than the original servicemen number of points they had to have. And we were put on a ship to be sent back to the United States again. And I ended up coming back through San Francisco and then going to Fort Sheridan, Illinois, and turned loose up there, and then got on the train and came back to Springfield. So.
Tell us what it was like to approach Springfield.
Well, everybody had their nose glued to the windows, I'll tell you for sure. Because most of them on there were from this area at that time, the train. And it so happened that my dad's business was right on Mill Street, which is where the train went down to the depot. And I could see that, and everything was still there. And that made you feel good, even though you were only about 2 blocks away from the station. And my mother and my father and my wife-to-be were all there waiting for me, which was rather nice. I got home about 5 or 6 days before Christmas. in 1946. So,
Wonderful day. What do you do? How did you adjust to civilian life, and did you go back to school, or what?
oh yeah, I went to college for a little while, and then of course worked with my dad at the coal yard, and then in the end of '47, I got married, and we kept going on the coal business for a while, and then natural gas came along, and I had to find something else to do.
Which was?
Well, I got in the food business, and one way or another, the wholesale business and the restaurant business, and things like that through most of my life. A number of different things on the side, but mostly in the food business up until about a year ago.
Have you had any contact with buddies from
Yeah,
Korea?
we had a group called 754 Reunion, and they started that about 1969 or 70, finding people, and we had one fellow who was real gung-ho for that type of thing, and he found a lot of members. We ended up with a reunion of different places, and usually around 75 to 80 at that time, and now it no longer because there's not enough of them that can travel, and well, they were from all over the United States.
You belong to the Air and Military Museum of the Ozarks. Tell our viewers what that's all about.
Well, the museum, we felt that, well, I shouldn't say we, because I wasn't here at the time, a number of ex-Air Force men, servicemen, decided about 20 years ago that they'd like to start a group and start a museum to preserve history and equipment and information, and it grew rather rapidly to start with, and we ended up with a larger place and a lot more members now, and we have lots of children come here and learn, and veterans that reminisce. And we've outgrown our space, but we're here, and I think everybody in the area in the country should go to a museum and learn what history has to tell them about the sacrifice and what people had to do through any war, not just the Second World War, but any time, because it's a terrible thing in the long run. And we seem to be a good target for other people wanting to give us trouble. So.
You mean the United States?
Yes.
Well, what is your position here at the museum?
Well, at the present, I'm chairman of the board.
Harry, it's been a great time here together with you, and I just wonder if you have any other recollections you'd like to add to this before we close?
No, not really, other than the fact that I have always felt that being in the service helped me a lot throughout my life, because it made me think and do things before I did something I shouldn't, the way I looked at it. It made me stop and pause, because I think it's a good thing, and I've always said that every young fella, and now every young lady that wants to, should get into service, one way or another, to have that experience.
Thank you very much.
You bet.
It's been a delight to have you here.
A glimpse back into, you mentioned that going down to the Frisco to the Harvey House.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I've got a little background on the Harvey House. My father was a Frisco railroad man, and I've been in a couple of Harvey Houses as a young man. Tell me your recollection of the Harvey House, because that's something that's gone forever.
Well, because it was one of the places to eat here in Springfield for a good many years.
And why was it so good?
Well, the food was good. The service was excellent.
What about the waitresses?
Their place was clean, and the waitresses were sharp and dressed sharp.
How did that happen?
Well, of course, Fred Harvey, who was a restaurant man, decided he would start putting eating places up and down the railroad, mainly the Santa Fe, I think, when it started. And then other railroads picked it up because people had to have a place to eat. Otherwise, they had to find a place when the train stopped for water or carry their lunch on the train, or maybe sometimes an old railroad hotel with a cafe in it or something like that. And they were very well operated. The waitresses could not be married. They all wear fancy, nice uniforms. They were well trained. They lived basically at the restaurant because, like here, the upstairs was the dormitory for the waitresses to live. And the food, as I say, was good, and they were well run. So everybody that wanted to would go down on Sunday and have lunch. Well, of course, other times too. And this happened to be that Sunday we were there when Pearl Harbor was bombed in 1941.
Do you remember the time of day? You know, there's a differential in here. So
It was 1 o'clock in the afternoon.
1 o'clock in the afternoon.
Yeah, see, that was 8 o'clock in Pearl Harbor.
So that meant that the news got out rather instantaneously.
Pretty fast, yeah. Because they did have national news, NBC and CBS, I think those were at that time still, of course, those radio stations. And they had a big old 4-model radio there in the restaurant, and people, the news was on and everything, and then they interrupted the program, whatever it was at that time, to announce that Pearl Harbor had been bombed. And I said, most of us didn't know where Pearl Harbor was. I mean, never heard of it.
Where were you sitting in proximity to that radio?
What are you talking about? Well, 3 feet this way and 7 feet that way. I don't know exactly, but we could hear it.
Well,
Yeah,
it's
in the room, in the dining room.
See, nowadays we'd go into a sports bar and there'd be a 30-inch TV up there and everybody could watch.
Yeah,
and if you go to a railroad station now, you might find that.
Yeah, just the big old radio was sitting over against the wall.
Yeah.
And of course the room is large, like this table is, like that. And they had a counter deal over here, and you came in from out of the railroad station itself because the party house was on the east end of the station.
Well, it was a dramatic moment, and do you remember anything about the details of the crowd, or did that cease lunch, or?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of it probably did. I don't remember exactly, Jim, because at that time, being 15 years old, it didn't register to me like it did the grown-ups.
Right, you were there with your parents.
Yeah.
And just your mother and father and you were sitting at a table.
Yeah.
Perhaps with other people.
Yeah.
And so there was probably conversation between your parents and others.
Well, yes, because, again, they had to figure out what it was. And, of course, when they said it was Hawaii and the Hawaiian Islands, things like that, people began to pick up the idea of what happened, and, of course, who it was that did it and what was going on. And I know we went home, and I'm sure we...
When you left there, you went and got into what model car?
Well, let's see. At that time, that was about a 1935 Dodge sedan.
And you got to sit in the back seat?
I got to sit in the back seat. I learned to drive on that 35 Dodge.
Okay, well, it was a good car. So then you went home, and then do you recall at all your folks call anybody or the phone? Or?
Well, yeah, they called all the relatives and things like that because, maybe they hadn't been listening just like you would today. Hadn't been listening to the radio or everything. Of course, it came out in the paper the next morning and all that what had happened, and best they knew at least.
How soon did you have any near relatives, uncles, cousins, others that went into the service right away?
No, I didn't because all my relatives were older people. I was born late time, And most of them, like I said, my uncle was in the First World War. And then my cousin, one of my cousins, it was the only one I had, first cousin here in Springfield, she married during the war, married a young fellow, and he was a Marine pilot. Made it through the whole thing. But no, I didn't have, not having any brothers or sisters, well, of course I didn't have anything like that.
You mentioned you were going to Greenwood, and by the time you graduated, the mobility of the general population had reduced the Greenwood class from 30 down to 18.
And it turned out it was 9 boys and 9 girls.
And that was quite a trick. How did they know to do that?
It turned out that way.
What's your recollection of the impact of the World War there in the classroom or in the daily operation and perhaps even the university? Do you remember any specifics?
Well, of course, little by little as it continued on, why we knew that we were going to go. In fact, part of the reason we had less boys. Several of them had joined the Navy or the Air Force and things like that during that senior year.
That's interesting in itself. They had to have permission from their parents, I guess, to join. Now, you turned 18 your senior year.
No, I turned 19.
19, okay.
I was a dummy in the class.
Now, I suspect that was the day, the month you were born. When you
No,
were
I had to take first grade over again.
Oh, really?
I was sick about 2/3 of the grade with every child disease you can imagine. Mumps, measles, chicken pox, diphtheria, the whole thing. And so I missed so much school I had to start over, so I've always been the oldest one in the class.
Okay. Did you have stamp drives, war stamps and war bonds
Oh,
in
war
school?
bonds, oh yeah.
Do you recall any detail there?
Yeah, everybody bought war bonds. You could buy them for $25, you could buy them $50, $100.
How about stamps?
Stamps, you could buy them and fill them up in a book and then turn that in for a war bond.
Did you do any of that in school?
Yeah. And then also the thing that school kids did, again, I said we had drives to gather up things for the war effort, I'm talking about bottles and cans, chewing gum wrappers.
How about cigarette packs?
Well, cigarette packs, they take them for string, bowls of string and makeup. Don't ask me what to use it for if they wanted it.
String?
Well,
Chewing gum wrappers. Now, what part of the chewing gum wrapper?
well, in those days, the gum itself was wrapped in a piece of foil. And then the outside was with paper. And so you'd save the chewing gum, enter some foil and roll it up, and then just keep rolling. Pretty soon you had a ball about that big around if you were chewing while chewing gum.
Did you ever pick up cigarette packs for the same reason?
No, not that I don't remember doing that. Of course, the Lucky Strike changed its package during that time because Lucky Strike Green had gone to war because the material that they made the green ink for with was used in someplace else in the military, so then they became a white package instead of the green package. We've got some of those, one or two of those, I think, over here in the home front in the museum of the green. And but you collected everything: bottles, you collected cans, you collected grease, clothing, and I said bed springs or parts of cars or anything you could find. Because those days the restriction on junk, shall we say, around the city wasn't as great as it is today. And you could find lots of things, old bicycles, or just anything.
What scrap drives that when you found those bed springs, was there a community place you took them to?
Yeah, there'd be a collection place in certain parts of the town. Of course, realizing Springfield was not as big then, there were only around 40,000 people then. compared with today, 135 or 40,000. That they had places where you put stuff, collect it, and then the trucks come around and pick that stuff up and haul it to the salvage yard where they separated it or whatever and shipped it off to the mills.
Let's leap clear back to Korea. You were there at the end of hostilities, but some of the hostiles didn't know that the end of hostilities occurred. And so did you, in your experience with your tank corps, have some hostile action?
Not in a true sense. Mainly what they did, they went all over the country where they knew that the Japanese had airfields or barracks and things like that. And they'd send a detachment in trucks and things. And then we'd go along with 2 or 3 tanks and move in first to the area. And once in a while they'd find 2 or 3 Japanese that were living off the land. And we had an interpreter with us. And he would tell them that the war had been over so long a time and what the date was now, and that the emperor said for them to. And we never had any trouble with most of them. Most of them was such bad health and so tired of being a soldier and everything that they just came on. They didn't worry about it, and they had a pretty good idea because of the way the countryside, I think, had operated around them. That the Koreans paid no more attention to them or anything else, and probably had told them that the war was over, but of course naturally they wouldn't believe it. We ran across an airfield where I wish we could be today. There was about 8 or 10 Zeros sitting there, and about a week later the Army came in with a bulldozer and went like that, piled them all up in one nice little heap of aluminum. And today I wish we could have had one of those.
Been a nice addition to the collection.
But that's about all there was at that in Korea. And then we became stabilizing force. In other words, the infantry became the police force, training them, and they had to build their country back in the idea that they were running it because the Japanese had run it for 40-some-odd years, and they were the slaves. And we show pictures of and Bill there knows what I'm talking about. The country, of course, is just bare almost the top of this. It was that time top of this table because the Japanese had cut down all the timber to use it to build barracks and to send over to Japan for different things. And the country was just bare. You'd see a tree, you might have one about that tall, and that's all it would be. A full-grown tree was a rare item to see because they had just skinned the country for lumber and to build buildings, factories, or whatever, homes or anything else. And of course, anything else they had there, they had taken away. So the people just lived off the land, literally. They had, of course, the paddies where they grew food and had chickens and things like that. But boy, they wanted to give us anything they could give us, and they didn't have anything to give.
Well, your insight into Korea is an interesting segue into the Korean War.
Right.
And that's another chapter for another time, and we have Korean
Well, the
veterans.
closest thing we came to having any trouble with North Koreans, and they weren't necessarily North Koreans. 2 nights we had to go out and fellas in the trucks especially, and if we had to go anywhere, they had to take a truck with an armored vehicle of some sort, half-track or something with them, because there was lots of groups getting together, fussing and raising things, and carrying torches at night, and screaming and hollering as the trucks would go by and everything. So we didn't know. They were, of course, communists, induced people to get rid of the Americans, but we never had any trouble with them or anything, but we weren't sure what they were doing.
So that, in your mind, was the beginning.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
And you were in Korea what period of time? From when?
All in 1946, practically.
And you arrived in
In January of 46.
You arrived in January '46
and left in early part, or rear end of November.
Okay.
Because it took us 28 days to come across the ocean.
All right, so these communist seeds had been planted.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the 38th Airline, of course, was there, and that's where we were up to. And that was the reason we were placed up there, was close to the 38th Airline.
And why do you think the 38th parallel was imparted then?
Well, that's the way they divided the country up. Russia and China and took the North half, and the Americans and the Allies took the second war half.
Okay, so that,
The country itself wasn't divided, starkly, no.
right.
There was no North and South, it was just Korea.
Yeah, that's my historical thing I'm drawing out of it. When the Japanese occupied, it was
It
Korea.
was all, the whole thing.
And when the hostilities ceased, it was Korea. But part of the treaty settlement,
With Russia, was they got half, northern half, and we got the southern half.
and the 38th parallel was
Yeah.
the dividing line.
Yeah, and that's at the time, of course, that really didn't mean too much, except they were separating the people in their own country. And at that time, they still could go back and forth. But a little later on, and then, of course, during the Korean War and all that, that ceased. They couldn't come across at all.
Let's talk a little logistics about the support of a team. Talk about the crew, the functions of the crew, and the support team behind it.
You mean of the military?
Well, let's just say one tank, and then there were so many tanks in a division or whatever.
There was 5 tanks in the company.
Okay.
So that's 25 men, and then they had a maintenance crew that followed them wherever they went. And of course, during the war, it was just on wheels all the time. And of course, the gasoline trucks try to keep up with them too, because they get good mileage. They get about 5 miles to a gallon when they're in rough country. And we carried 250 gallons on either side, which was bad too. That's the thing. That tank sitting right there on the side where the round could go through it. But that's the way they designed them. And then, of course, the crew, we lived in and on the tank, literally. We had all of our supplies and our food and sea rations and things like that right there. And then they did the normal maintenance, like check the greasing the wheels and things like that, and checking the oil and looking after the tank just like you would your car. And every time you stopped, you did that. Of course, fill it up with gas, and then you stayed with it. You slept with it, you ate with it.
Tried to be prepared at all times.
Yeah, and somebody was always up in the turret on duty if the others were sleeping either inside or outside.
Now, you mentioned 5 men per tank,
Mm-hmm.
and did they all ride inside the tank when they were in it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, it was cozy.
And were each able to do everybody else's job, or did each of you have your own job?
No, everybody had to know how to do everything. That's as far as the operation of the tank, everything. And of course, the original idea was that you had a driver who was on the left side, and then you had an assistant driver. Well, of course, that was kind of a stupid thing, because the driver got killed. Usually everybody else got hurt too. But they were thinking somebody got shot or something. And then the assistant driver, actually in the Sherman, had the same controls as he had. He didn't have to climb over there. He could go ahead and drive from his side also. But in the meantime, he had a .30 caliber machine gun sitting in the front of him through the front of the tank. So when he wasn't needed, why then he could shoot the .30 caliber machine gun wherever they were going to a certain degree of angle on one side or the other. So he didn't just go for a ride. His job was that too. And of course, then you had the loader and the gunner, and then you had a 50 caliber up on top that the commander or the loader or gunner could operate, because you had hatches on 2 places on the top, so they could come up to it.
The 50 caliber on top was operated by somebody that was on top,
Yeah.
outside of the
Outside.
tank and up on top.
Yeah, it was really supposedly for aircraft, but they use it for everything. But,
Right. When you're sitting in there driving, what kind of visibility do you have?
well, when it's buttoned up, all you've got is a periscope, which is about that wide and about that high you're looking through. Of course, it goes in like this and up through the hatch, and of course it faces this way. And that's all you can see, and you can turn it. Whoever's looking out of it, the driver, I think, can turn it a little bit, left or right. But up on top, the M4s all had a big hatch where the commander, and also it was about that tall where it went up to the hatch, and this was a glass all the way around, but thick glass. It was probably that thick and only about that high, and he could stick his head up enough to see around himself. Now he had a periscope also, but he could see all the way around. And the reason he did that was because so many times, especially the Japanese and even the Germans, would drop out of trees on the back of the tank. And that's the reason they learned real fast that the infantry had to go everywhere the tank went. It sounds like the old idea in the First World War, the tank went first and the infantry came along. Well, it was the other way around in a way. They either rode on it or walked with it or somewhere close, because the tank is very vulnerable on the back, because your engine's back there and your air intake's back there. And all they had to do is, like the Russians with their Molotov cocktail, all they had to do was drop that down in there and the back of the tank was on fire. Because the engine's back there and the gasoline and everything else. So they wanted it so he could see all the way around. Now you had a hatch on the side in the back of the turret that you could raise up and use your grease gun or your .45 to shoot them off the back if you didn't have any infantry to help you out at that time. And the grease gun was a little bit, a .45 caliber machine gun. It was about that long with a stock that would slide in or out. And it looked like an old-fashioned grease gun, literally, with a handle and trigger. And shot the same caliber bullet as a .45 caliber pistol. And of course that was a good thing, because .45 will really knock you down in a hurry, so they didn't have to worry about it. But a lot of times the guy would see him, I think he'd just raise it up like